Hello and welcome to the final chapter in the course. And as with all good conclusions and recommendations, I'm going to try and keep it short and focused. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover. So in the first instance, I just want to do a bit of a recap of all of the different elements that we've covered during the course, and then a little overview of the elements that should be in your conclusions and recommendations for your dissertation. So just as a reminder, we started off by asking ourselves, what is the point of your dissertation? Why are you doing it, and how are you doing it, and who are you doing it for? I'm hoping now that we have covered pretty much all of those bases in some way or another, and that you've got a pretty clear idea what the answer to each of those questions is. And the bottom line, of course, is that your dissertation is an opportunity for you to practice and develop and demonstrate your critical thinking skills, your ability to gather information and to critically evaluate the information, to perform analyses, and to solve problems and then communicate the solutions to your readers. These are all fundamental skills that we as scientists in academia or in industry need to demonstrate to our future employers, and we will need them for the rest of our career. We need to be critical thinkers, and we need to demonstrate that we're critical thinkers. So if you remember the report itself, it mirrors all of the activities of the dissertation through the process of your background reading, your literature review, where you discover what we know and what we don't know, where the gaps are in our knowledge. And that forms the basis then for the aims and objectives of the study. So what are we going to do to fill those gaps? Which questions do we want to address? Those aims giving us an overview of what we're trying to achieve, and those objectives giving us very specific questions that we're going to address by some analytical process resulting in some kind of deliverable, a map or a cross-section, a list, or whatever that deliverable might be, but very, very specific to-do list. And to do this, we're going to need data, either supplied from a third party or data that we generate ourselves through our own analyses. And that leads, of course, and is related to the methods that we're going to employ in the course of our study. And of course, data and methods, very closely related. We need to document the methods, the limitations and the uncertainties of those methods, and the errors that might result from those analytical methods, be they objective or subjective uncertainties leading to systematic or random errors. And how do we deal with all of those? How do we document them, and how do we take them all into account? These are all different skills, knowledge and skills that we need at each stage of this process. Having established the methods and the data, we then go on to look at the results that we generate from our analyses and the scientific reasoning that we need to make the arguments and discuss the outcomes of those analytical methods. Ultimately then, of course, that all converges on our conclusions. So these are the outcomes of the analytical process and should demonstrate that we have dealt with each of the objectives right back at the beginning, so that the reader can see some closure. Maybe, though, we don't deal with all of the objectives, and maybe there's still things to do, almost always, and those become the recommendations, which really are also very important as well. And yet, the conclusions and recommendations so very often get left to the very last minute before the dissertation or the report is submitted or dispatched to the client. And it really needs to be given much higher status, and we need to be considering this final outcome, the conclusions, throughout the whole process, and not just at the end of the study. And that's all backed up by our references, all of the literature that we've consulted during the course of our study, and of course our appendices, which will be full of detailed methodological descriptions and processes and workflows and all the data that we've used during the course of our study. And as I said, that set of components of the report correspond to a whole range of different skills, and we can take the opportunity to develop those skills and showcase those skills throughout this whole process. So you get a chance to develop and demonstrate your research skills, your ability to find the information from literature searches, using the library, using search engines, and so on and so forth. Then, once you've gathered the information, how do you actually internalize it? How do you learn? How does it become part of your internal reference system? Or how do you store information in IT systems so that it can be easily retrieved when you need it? So learning and knowledge management go hand in hand, and they are, again, very important skills that we need to recognize, to practice, and to master. Then the data itself, the data management. How do we QC the data? How do we store it? How do we retrieve it, plot it, process it, and all of these good things? And how does the data relate to the methods from which the data was derived, and what are the errors and uncertainties in those analytical methods? And how do we process those uncertainties, be they objective or subjective uncertainties? And how do we define them as errors, whether they're systematic or random? And how do we document that? And how do we evaluate the implications of those uncertainties and those errors? That's all part of that process, and that's all the foundation of our scientific reasoning. So we have degrees and PhDs and so on, so we should all be scientists, so we should be masters of scientific reasoning. But as I've mentioned so many times along the way, this is not necessarily explicitly taught. It's kind of assumed in many cases. So we have to put the effort in to make sure we understand the logical argumentation process and the terminology of logical argumentation and of inductive, deductive and abductive reasoning and hypothesis testing and so on and so forth. So what is the difference between a strong and a weak and a valid and an invalid argument, and which of those arguments are sound, unsound, cogent or uncogent? Those are all very specific terms in scientific reasoning, and they should be used in their specific context. Then once we've got past the scientific reasoning, we've made the arguments and we've established the outcomes to our objectives, then we need to communicate those with words to a certain extent, of course, but also, more importantly, I think, with illustrations, well-designed, well-annotated illustrations of various types. And in this day and age, those are expected to be digital, and more than likely you'll have to create them yourself. So it's a very good idea to develop those digital illustration skills, starting maybe in PowerPoint, but then going on to the more sophisticated drawing packages like Illustrator or CorelDRAW. But in this case we used Inkscape because it's free. So illustration skills, very useful, very important, and a great tool to have in your toolbox. But all of this then requires project management, and we've looked at project management. This is something you will always be involved in, either as a project manager or as a member of a team that is being managed and therefore part of the project management process. So whether you're doing the managing or being managed, you have to understand the project management process in order to get the best out of the process. And that whole project management process is designed to help us avoid disasters, and that's surely what we all want to do, is either plan to avoid the disasters or at least have the tools in place to enable us to mitigate or manage those problems when they occur, and that is project management. And then finally, ironically, the thing that I would do first is start my project plan. So the project plan, all of those elements, the background, aims, objectives, data, methods, results, discussion, conclusions, recommendations, references, appendices, all of those pigeonholes, those are where you initially start by defining what each is and what is going into each compartment. And you start that on day one. And throughout your study, you're adding to your methodological descriptions, you're adding to your database potentially, you're adding to your discussion, you're building up your library of illustrations, so that the report is the plan. The report is a means by which you manage everything, and the report is the final deliverable that you hand over to your supervisor, examiner, boss, client, whoever the recipient of your final production is. So don't think about planning your report in the last week before the deadline. Start planning your report on day one and use it as a means to keep everything under control throughout the whole project plan. Excellent. Okay, so hopefully you've got a much better understanding now of the elements of the project, the elements of the project plan, and all of the very varied skills that go with each stage. And these aren't clearly are not just geoscience skills. These are very generic in many ways, transferable skills, which are applicable to so many different industries. So this is not just focusing you in on one specific skill set. This is an opportunity to develop all of those professional life skills, if you like. So just to conclude the conclusions, what should you actually put in your conclusions and recommendations in your dissertation? Well, what you should be putting in there is confirmation that you have addressed all of the objectives. It's important to summarize the outcomes of your work. Excuse me, drying up. So we don't want to repeat all of the details that we've covered throughout our methodological descriptions and our results discussions and so on and so forth. All of that is leading up to this sort of summary statements on the end, which demonstrate how the objectives have been addressed and communicate the outcomes to each objective. And it's important to make that connection between the objectives at the beginning and conclusions at the end, because I've literally seen reports where people have studiously listed 10 objectives, but then only addressed 5 or 6 of them in the conclusions. The other 4 or 5 have somewhere disappeared somewhere along the course of the project, never to be seen again. And that's really not a very good way to go about it. So start with, they're bookends really, you start with those 10 objectives at the front and you finish with the 10 conclusions at the end which are addressing those objectives. But then having looked at the specifics of the objectives, you can look at the wider implications. What are the implications for these conclusions in terms of the sort of wider subject area? And it's also quite possible that you don't actually manage to specifically address every objective, in which case you also need to make that clear. But don't worry, that's something then which feeds straight into the recommendations. So when you've considered the implications and when you've identified objectives which haven't been satisfactorily addressed, then you have the basis for recommendations. And again, conclusions and recommendations, get very often left to the last minute. You know, it's the last thing on the end of the report, and the report was left too late, and then the conclusions were like an hour before the submission deadline. And it really shouldn't be like that. These conclusions and recommendations should be developing throughout the course of the study. We're making decisions throughout the study that we can and can't do things, and whenever I reach a point where something I decide cannot be done for reasons of lack of time, resources, data, or whatever, I immediately park that in the recommendations section so that when I eventually get to finish that off, it's already sat there waiting for me. So this whole report is not something which is done at the end. It's something that starts at the beginning and it builds up throughout your study. It's the means of planning your study. It's the means of managing all of the different elements of your study as they grow throughout the study. And that final week of reporting is when you should be dotting the I's and crossing the T's. It's not the point at which you should be thinking about it for the first time. And that's the main message, I think, for me, is to front load your project, do the thinking and the planning and so on at the beginning when you've got the time and when it's not going to be very expensive if you make mistakes, instead of leaving it to the end and hoping that it will somehow all come together. And from my experience as a technical QCer, as an editor and as an examiner, that's where an awful lot of projects fail. That's where people get into trouble and they need to extend the deadlines, and they incur all sorts of can't think of the word. They lose marks, is what I'm trying to say, because they're late in submitting, and they really didn't need to happen. So often it can all be traced back to not having done the planning in the first place. And that's what I'm trying to help everybody avoid, basically, is to think about those things and avoid those problems as much as possible. And for those problems that can't be avoided, at least have a project management framework in place which enables you to deal with the problems and manage them. That's what the whole process of project management is all about. So I think that's enough from me now. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've got as much out of it as I have. As I've mentioned so many times, the teaching of these things is really a tremendous opportunity to learn, and putting this content together, I've learned so much, and I hope you do the same. So go away, continue to learn, continue to teach, and the whole learning cycle will continue. If there's anything else you want to add, anything else you can think of that we've missed or needs expanding upon, then please do put your comments in the discussion forums. And also, there's a questionnaire, a final feedback form, nice bit of alliteration, where I'm asking you for a little bit more detailed feedback in terms of what worked and what didn't, and so on and so forth. And once that feedback is completed, then the system should automatically send you a certificate of completion. That's your prize for getting to the end of the whole process. So thank you once again. Thank you for being part of the course, part of the community. Don't disappear. Stay in touch. You've got lifelong access to this content, which, as you can see, will be growing, and things will be replaced and updated all the time. So look upon it as a lifelong resource, which I'll have to hand over quite soon, getting a bit grey. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye for now.